All right, welcome back to Always Adaptive. My name is Randall James, and if you're not familiar with my channel, one of the things I like to do here is take somewhat divisive topics and break down both sides. I think in today's day and age, we're seeing a little bit too much behavior rewarded by the algorithm that's just divisive in nature, where people talk crap about each other and they talk very matter-of-factly about a topic. And my experience has always been that the answer is not one side or the other. It's usually smack dab in the middle. And so that's something I like to do here, is objectively sift through the data and see what the answer is. And of course, as always, at the end of it, I always give my take. So today we're talking about sucralose, and this is one of the most popular artificial sweeteners on the market right now. You probably have a protein powder or an energy drink or something in your house right now that has sucralose. And even if you don't think you do, because most of the stuff that you have isn't low carb, I assure you there are still products on the market right now that have sugar, real sugar in it, and have sucralose in it. A good example is Black Rifle Coffee. Some of their canned beverages in the grocery store right now have about 18 to 20 grams of sugar, and it also has sucralose in it, which doesn't really make any sense. But that just speaks to how prominent this compound has become. And I think people are really looking for an answer on whether or not this is something to be concerned about. Now, when I dive into this, I'm not here to defend the food industry, and I'm also not here to scare you. I'm here to just objectively sift through, what does the data say? I might provide a little bit of my own anecdote, my own experience, because I consumed sucralose for a really long time before I caught wind of it and actually started informing myself on the topic. And so after that, you'll get my full take at the end, and it'll be probably not what you're expecting. It's not going to be some definitive take. It usually never is, but I think we need more of that today, and I'm here to provide it. So let's get into it. I'm going to talk about four major points. We're going to talk about glucose metabolism. We're going to talk about the gut microbiome being altered by sucralose. We're going to talk about the mutagenic concerns, because there are concerns that it can destroy DNA and sometimes even mutate DNA, which leads into cancer. And then we're also going to talk about weight management, because obviously that's the biggest reason why someone would consume sucralose, is to help them control their weight. So before we get into that, we need to talk about sucralose's origin story. Now, you may or may not have heard there is this insecticide claim that sucralose was originally intended to be an insecticide. And there is some truth to that. Now, it can't be fully confirmed, but sucralose was discovered in 1976 by researchers at Tate and Lyle. They were working at King's College in London, and they were looking at chlorinated sucrose derivatives. So the reason why this gets tied into the insecticide point is because most insecticides and pesticides are already chlorinated products. So the thought here is that these scientists were investigating chlorinated sucrose for its potentiality as an insecticide. Now, the story goes that one of the scientists told the other scientists to test the compound. They misheard them for taste it. They tasted it, found out that it was super sweet, and then thus begins the story of how that makes it into our food. Now, sucralose contains 3 chlorine atoms, which makes it very chemically similar to a lot of the pesticides on the market. So is it actually intended to be an insecticide? There's no paper trail or recorded quotes or anything of someone saying that, but is it a stretch to make it from point A to point B and assume that maybe they were testing it as such? Sure. And there is some research that shows that sucralose in high doses actually can kill insects, which kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Now, the first point we're going to talk about here is, does sucralose impair glucose metabolism? We're going to break down 2 key studies, one that raised alarm bells, and then the other that kind of reverses that. And I think that is the key concept of today's episode. You're going to see really quick that, and this is a big problem with science in the first place. I was just talking to someone about this a couple of weeks ago. One study will come out that says one thing, and then another study will come out that says the exact opposite of that. And sometimes they'll even recrunch the same numbers of the same study and find a completely different result. So when people try to talk matter-of-factly and say sucralose is terrible or sucralose is completely harmless, both of those are statements that you need to be aware of and, take it all with a grain of salt. So I'm just going to go through these two studies. And again, like I said, at the end, I'll give my take and you can form your own opinion. But my hope is that I provide you with the tools necessary for you to do so. So study number one, we're going to talk about, it's Pepino et al. From 2014. It's entitled Sucralose Affects Glycemic and Hormonal Responses to an Oral Glucose Load. This is out of the American Diabetes Association. The study design was obese individuals who were insulin sensitive were given sucralose sweetened beverages, and then there was a control group that was just given plain water. They used an oral glucose tolerance test and measured the insulin response afterwards. What they found was that the sucralose group had a 20% higher insulin response compared to the water group. Glucose levels didn't differ significantly, but the insulin spike raised concerns about insulin resistance or altered glycemic signaling. Now, a 20% higher insulin response is pretty concerning, right? That would sound off alarm bells in your head. However, something to take into account here is there's something called the expectation effect, and that can be triggered just by tasting something. So if you put something sweet in your mouth and you just swish it around and then you spit it out, you don't actually intake any carbohydrates, your body can behave as if you just consumed some actual carbohydrates. This is I don't want to say it's well documented, but there are studies that have looked at that. For example, this study entitled Carbohydrate Sensing in the Human Mouth Effects on Exercise Performance and Brain Activity. This was a placebo-controlled trial where they tested glucose and maltodextrin mouthwashes against a placebo, and all they had them do was just rinse it around in their mouth and then spit it out. They saw that the glucose and the maltodextrin groups, even though they did not consume the solutions, saw an increase in power output, and they also saw changes in their brain imaging. So while the 20% insulin increase sounds dramatic, you have to keep in mind that the expectation effect, if your placebo is just people drinking water, they know they're drinking water. So of course, there's not going to be any sort of effect there. But if it's a sweetened beverage, then there could be an expectation effect present there. A better design would be a capsule form where they put the sucralose actually in capsule, or they put the control, the placebo, in capsule, so that taste is no longer of effect. And just to drive that home, we're going to talk about study number 2 here. So this is entitled Short-Term Impact of Sucralose Consumption on the Metabolic Response and Gut Microbiome of Healthy Adults, British Journal of Nutrition, Cambridge Core. This is from 2021, randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial, 34 healthy adults. 17 participants consumed 780 milligrams a day of sucralose in capsule form. Just to put that in perspective, in the other study, it was 48 milligrams. So this is orders of magnitude more sucralose. The other one found a 20% increase in insulin. You would expect to see something similar here, right? The control group, 17 participants, consumed placebo capsules. So both groups were consuming a capsule. The duration was 7 days, and the measurements they took, again, oral glucose tolerance test, and they used the homeostatic model assessment of insulin resistance, measures fasting insulin and fasting glucose, and then they used the Matsuda index for detailed insulin sensitivity. And what they found, no significant differences in glucose or insulin response between the sucralose and placebo groups. Body weight remained stable, insulin resistance scores were unchanged. So this speaks volumes to how study design is super, super, super important. They eliminated the expectation effect by getting rid of the sweet taste. You put it in capsule, you can no longer taste the sucralose. So the idea that sucralose spikes insulin just does not hold up against better test design. People will cite these studies, and this is why it's important to not just take one study, but try to read a few. Obviously, most of us don't have time to read every single study out there. But you gotta, if someone says something to you and they send you a study, see if there's a study out there that counteracts it. But so the next segment we're going to talk about is the gut microbiome. Now, first, I want to start off by saying, I want to talk about what we don't know. So a lot of people talk about the gut microbiome. They talk about probiotics, prebiotics, gut bacteria, all this stuff. And this field is still young. I mean, really, it started gaining popularity in the 2000s. And it wasn't until 2007 that the NIH launched the Human Microbiome Project. This was a major turning point. But this isn't just humility, it's reality. When people pretend like they know exactly what kind of gut bacteria species everyone's gut should be populated with, in my opinion, they are talking right out of their rear end, because they don't know. This is not a definitive science whatsoever. One gut bacteria species might be good for one person, and for someone that lives on the other side of the globe, it might be terrible for them. What looks like gut dysbiosis in one person might be totally fine in another person. There is no gold standard for like a healthy microbiome, and there aren't any standard reference ranges like we have for blood pressure or blood glucose or anything. Like, even if you know a diverse gut flora is important, we don't know the quantity of each species that we should have. And even more intriguingly, some diets that eliminate fiber altogether, like the carnivore or ketogenic diets, seem to help heal the gut. Now, the big thing is that fiber helps to create short chain fatty acids. There are some species of gut bacteria that consume the fiber and help create those short chain fatty acids, which are then in turn food for your colonocytes, which are like cells in your colon that are constantly being turned over and doing their thing. And so more fiber, more short chain fatty acids, and then better colonocyte health. However, is it that carnivore or keto diets are giving your digestive system a rest, and a much needed rest, and taking away some of the chaos, allowing your gut to heal? Or is it that a carnivore diet provides a different type of food for different species of gut bacteria? I mean, there's a thought out there that very similar to how fiber from plant food is food for gut bacteria. What if the cartilage and other pieces of animal food were food for a very specific, different type of gut bacteria? Again, this is still a very new field and people cannot talk definitively. So with that out of the way, I just wanted to throw that caveat in there, because people will talk about, oh, this compound disrupts your gut microbiome, or this food or this thing. And in reality, we don't know what a healthy gut microbiome actually is or looks like. So with that out of the way, now we can talk about sucralose and what the evidence actually says. So again, we're going to talk about two studies. The first study, this is from 2022. This is entitled 10-Week Sucralose Consumption Induces Gut Dysbiosis and Altered Glucose and Insulin Levels in Healthy Young Adults. The design was healthy adults, 48 milligrams a day sucralose in water for 10 weeks. And once again, the control group was just plain water. So right off the bat, we're introducing that expectation effect. And yes, that does affect gut bacteria. Now, what they found was that lactobacillus, which is a very popular probiotic, it's a very popular supplement, it's found in certain foods, that was decreased. Now, why is that important? Lactobacillus is associated with decrease in antibiotic-induced diarrhea and is also a helpful enzyme for dairy products. They also found that Bladia was increased, and this is associated with obesity. Insulin levels increased, and area under the glucose curve also increased. Now, just again, reminding you that expectation, sweets, we got to remember that. Now, what do these microbiome shifts actually mean? Now, this is where I draw back in that we really don't know what's good and what's bad. Lactobacillus, often called a probiotic, found in yogurt and other supplements, it helps with lactose digestion, gut immunity, and pathogen defense. Sounds great, right? Except lactobacillus has been implicated in small intestinal bacteria overgrowth. This is a very common condition. And in some cases, it's also associated with brain fog, bloating, and fatigue. So it's not just all good. This isn't one of those cases where we can say more lactobacillus equals better symptoms or smarter brain or, less chronic conditions. It doesn't work that way. So the original study that tried to pin sucralose as this sort of microbiome disruptor bad guy found an increase in Bladia. Bladia is initially flagged as a bad guy due to associations with obesity and visceral fat. That was from a 2019 Nature study. But hold up, just when you think Bladia is the villain, this 2024 paper entitled The Gut Commensal Bladia Maintains Colonic Mucus Function Under Low Fiber Consumption Through Secretion of Short-Chain Fatty Acids. This is out of Nature. They took humans, fed them more fiber for 3 months, then took their poop, put it in mice, because apparently we're all out of ways to just study people directly. And what happened? The mice that got the fiber poop developed a stronger gut mucus barrier. And guess who showed up in higher numbers? Bladia. Turns out Bladia was making short chain fatty acids and helping maintain the gut lining, which is super important. And then another 2024 paper entitled Bladia coccoides is a newly identified bacterium increased by leucine deprivation and has a novel function in improving metabolic disorders. This study showed that Bladia improves insulin sensitivity and reduces body fat in high-fat diet mice. So now we're left in, which is it, dangerous or protective? And the answer is yes. Now, back to sucralose. Where does sucralose fit into all this? We're going to go back to the Cambridge study from when we were talking about glucose metabolism and how sucralose may affect that. That study, not only did they measure glucose metabolism, but they also measured the gut microbiome. So once again, this was a study from 2021, 34 healthy adults consuming 780 milligrams a day of sucralose capsules. So again, they eliminated that expectation effect from tasting something sweet. And then the control group had capsules as well, just a placebo. Duration 7 days, no significant change in gut microbiome, no change in insulin, glucose, or body weight. So again, this speaks volumes to how tasting something sweet can completely alter our physiology. And if you see a study, look at the study design, ask a couple questions. Are there any design flaws with this study? Because chances are you could probably come up with a laundry list of them. So where does that leave us? We have one study that shows microbiome shifts and glucose changes after 10 weeks of sweetened water. And then we have another study that shows nothing after a mega dose of sucralose delivered in capsules. I personally am leaning towards the mega dose, just the sheer amount of sucralose that they were giving these people for it to not have any effect at all. That's super interesting to me. Now let's talk about the mutagenic concerns. There's not that much data out there, but there is some. And one thing we need to start with is a compound called sucralose 6 acetate. Now, this is a byproduct that's formed in the formation of sucralose itself that can make it into the final product in small amounts. And yes, there are some serious red flags with this stuff. We're going to talk about a really elegant study entitled Toxicological and Pharmacokinetic Properties of Sucralose 6 Acetate and its parent sucralose in vitro screening assays. In vitro, this is lab setting, so we have to take this with a grain of salt. This doesn't always translate to entire human bodies because they're completely bypassing the digestive system here. Now, they did a whole bunch of tests in this study, but there are some specific findings that I want to go over here. The DNA damage test, the result, sucralose 6 acetate caused DNA strand breaks, a clear genotoxic response, even more so when metabolized. So that sounds pretty bad, right? But when we go to the bacterial mutation test, this is a classic test to see if a compound causes mutations in bacteria. The result, there were no mutations, so it may damage the DNA, but not necessarily mutate it permanently. Gut barrier test. They looked at how the compound affects gut lining integrity. The result, at high doses, it caused the gut lining to collapse, what people call leaky gut. Sucralose did too, but only at much higher doses. They also did a micronucleus test, and this checks if cells start forming broken or extra chromosomes. And the result is, yes, it increased chromosomal damage at high doses, and that's not what you want your food doing. Now, again, this is in vitro, and the bottom line is sucralose might be safe at low doses, but sucralose 6 acetate, as I said, has some really bad red flags. It's not looking so innocent. DNA damage, gut barrier disruption, enzyme inhibition. It's really concerning. And I have my own anecdote for this. So for those of you that don't know, I actually have ulcerative pancolitis. Colitis is a form of inflammatory bowel disease. I've had it since I was a teenager. I've been battling this thing. It's a really nasty disease. And so with that, I'm very limited with the types of foods that I can consume and compounds and supplements. There are things that just bother me a lot quicker than they would bother the average person. Sucralose is one of those things. So I had been consuming sucralose in various products for a while. And, I didn't realize that there was all this concern about it. And then I started doing a little bit of research, and that led me, one of the more popular tools for people that have IBD is like a food journal or a pain journal or symptom journal, whatever you want to call it. And so in starting that and starting to look at my sucralose consumption, I found a direct link to some of my flare-ups and sucralose. Specifically, one of the products I was consuming a lot of was Isopure protein powder. So they have a 0-carb protein powder. And I stopped taking that, and overnight, my symptoms seem to have subsided. Now I use Jocko Mulk, which is sweetened with monk fruit as opposed to sucralose. But I'm not going to say that sucralose is affecting you the same way that it affects me. I have a very special circumstance in having colitis. You might be perfectly healthy. So this isn't me saying that you shouldn't take it. This is me saying that you should pay attention to how this stuff makes you feel. Now let's zoom out a little bit here. Context matters, and why in vitro lab settings you have to take them with a grain of salt is because this is where the amounts that they're giving these cells compared to the amounts that a human being would actually be exposed to in some sort of non-calorie beverage are much different. So Let's talk about the doses. The damage in that study happened at 0.8 to 1.6 millimolar concentrations. Compare that to real life exposure. A diet soda might give you 0.4 milligrams of sucralose 6 acetate total. That gets diluted across your entire system. So it's not as though you have one cell being exposed to that 0.4 milligrams. Your estimated blood exposure might be 0.08 micrograms per milliliter. So that's 4,000 to 8,000 times lower than what caused damage in the lab. And the second catch is that we don't actually know that sucralose 6 acetate ends up in the products on the shelves. Again, it is a product that forms due to the creation of sucralose and sometimes ends up in the final product. We don't know. The study found up to 0.67% in raw sucralose powder. We don't know if that's consistent across brands. We don't know what happens to it when you bake it, store it, mix it. We don't know how much of it actually reaches your gut. So this isn't like a clean, it's safe, or it's toxic conversation. As I've said in other episodes, other videos, this is all just one big experiment. So it's up to you to pay attention to how these foods make you feel. Now, finally, we're going to get to the weight loss component of this. And this is the big one. This is what ties all of this together, because with all the stuff that I just spoke about, it's like, is it bad? Is it good? Well, the thing that matters the most, as most of you would agree, obesity is a massive health concern. And what we have to think about is the risk to reward profile here. If sucralose helps you lose weight, could that mitigate any sort of risk that might come along for the ride in small doses? And I'm saying in small doses. If someone's stacking sucralose products where they may be having Isopure that has sucralose in it, at the same time they're drinking energy drinks that have sucralose in it, at the same time they're eating some of these protein bars that have sucralose in it, I think total exposure is also extremely important and a point that people don't really think about. But if we're just talking about, let's say someone has one product that they consume daily that has sucralose in it, and that helps. Let's talk about diet sodas. Maybe they're consuming a diet soda that helps them stay in a caloric deficit. If they lose a ton of weight, let's say that helps them lose 50 pounds. Is that 50 pounds coming off worth the risk profile, potential risk profile of the stuff we just talked about? Because again, remember, none of that is definitive. It's all kind of back and forth. One study says this, another study says that. And that's where, like, this is how I feel about seed oils as well. If someone can lose weight using some of these products, sucralose, or eating some processed foods that have seed oils, if that happens to help them lose weight, then I don't really think it's that big of a deal, as long as they are taking note of how they feel. If they're consuming some of these products and they're getting arthritis, they're just joint pains, lower back pain, knee pain, whatever, or their skin's breaking out, they're getting eczema or any of these other conditions, their digestive system's getting irritated, because that's very common with some of these artificial sweeteners, specifically the sugar alcohols, xylitol, erythritol. Those are two things I have to stay away from as well because of my colitis, and they do irritate my gut. So those are things that it's context dependent, right? But I want to talk about this study. It's entitled A Randomized Control Trial Contrasting the Effects of 4 Low-Calorie Sweeteners and Sucrose on Body Weight in Adults with Overweight or Obesity. The objective was to compare 4 low-calorie sweeteners, saccharin, aspartame, Reb A, which is ribadioside A, a natural sweetener, and sucralose, and sucrose on body weight over a 12-week period. The participants were assigned to consume beverages sweetened with one of the low-calorie sweeteners or sucrose. Energy intake was monitored to assess changes across the intervention. The conclusion is that sucralose consumption did not lead to weight gain and was associated with reduced energy intake, suggesting its potential utility in weight management. And that, I think, is the point. I think sucralose can be used as an intentional tool for people to use in their toolkit to help them lose weight. Do I think it should be a cornerstone of their diet? Or do I think that they should be stacking various sucralose products on top of each other? No, I don't think that's a good idea. I think with how new this compound is, and with the origin story of it potentially being intended to be used as an insecticide, I think we have to be wary that we are running an experiment right now. And obesity is linked to all kinds of chronic conditions, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, arthritis, all kinds of things. So I don't think it's such a big deal to help people lose weight by replacing sugary drinks. And I think that's not to dismiss it, But the only major concern that I do is the genotoxicity data. And of course, that kind of lines up with my own ulcerative colitis experience. But I don't think most people need to worry about that because I don't see most people consuming this sucralose in these amounts that would really be concerning. And again, the amount that a human would be exposed to is much less than what they exposed these individual cells to in that study. So my final thoughts are this: treat sucralose the same way you treat glucose, right? If you're living a healthy life, you're monitoring the amount of glucose you're intaking, because having too much of it can lead to excess body fat. It can put you in a caloric surplus, leading to weight gain and leading to all kinds of other conditions. So you monitor that. You should monitor sucralose, considering it is sucrose, right? It's chlorinated sucrose. This is one big experiment. So pay attention to how your body responds. Use it with intention, not mindlessness. But anyways, I hope I've done a good job laying out both the pros and cons of sucralose and kind of wading my way through the middle of it. If you want to eat sucralose, you are free to do so. I'm not going to demonize you. I'm not going to tell you you're bad for doing so. Just be aware that there is evidence out there that you should be concerned about. But we're going to see how the rest of the data unfolds as time goes on. And there are people that are actively monitoring the situation, which is great. But if you learn anything new from this episode, please hit the like button, subscribe, hit the notification bell so you get notified every time I release a new video. I really appreciate that. If you're still here sticking around, then I appreciate you. You're really helping me out in terms of the watch time and the algorithm. But once again, my name is Randall James. I'm a strength and running coach. And one of my big passions is helping runners learn how to strength train at home, because who wants to have a gym membership? It's super annoying and you have to dish out extra money anyway. And so that is where my true passion lies. I also, if people want to train for a race, I help them do so. But if you're interested in any coaching inquiries, feel free to email me at randall@alwaysadaptive.com. And yeah, I will see you at the next one.